So, welcome to today's episode. I'm thrilled to announce Josephine DeWidl, a solo practitioner in Indigenous law, criminal defense, and child protection. Now, Josephine's got a bit of a story where she's moved around a fair bit. She used to be in Saskatoon, and she's now established her own law firm in Toronto. And what's really drawn me into Josephine's story is her practice, which focuses on Indigenous law, which is an area of law I have no clue about, and also how her journey really talks about the role that personal conviction that intersects with professional expertise, how that helps her build a practice whilst that stays true to her core mission. So, Josephine, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about Indigenous law. Actually, before we do that, can you just share a little bit of your story in terms of how you arrived to where you are today?
Yeah, happily. So after university, well, if you can't tell, I have an English accent. So I was born in Leeds in the UK, and I went to University of Kiel. And as soon as I finished university, I had an opportunity to come to Canada. Um, I was planning on just spending a year here and then going back and doing my master's, but I managed to find a job within a week of coming to Saskatoon, working as a legal assistant for Donald Worm and Helen Samaganus at Samaganus Worm Legal in Saskatoon. And they really took me under their wing. Donald Worm saw that I had a law degree and said, well, why don't you just stay here and article? So I had a very interesting conversation with my parents about that possibility. I was 20 years and they pushed me. They said, just go for it. At the time when I had moved, it was 2008, and there was an economic crisis that had hit. And everywhere seemed to be really struggling, particularly for new graduates at that time, except Saskatoon. Saskatoon was a place that appeared to be booming in 2008. So I got some very good advice from some people that I knew that recommended that I start my career off in Saskatoon. And I worked with Donald Worm and Helen Samaganus and their family at their law firm. And it's through that I really became um, really passionate about Indigenous issues. I'd done history before in university, well, not in university, but in school, all the way up to 18. And a lot of my university courses, I'd specifically taken ones that were involved in politics and human rights and globalization. And so coming to Saskatoon and then learning about this colonial history piece that had been somewhat whitewashed, to be honest, in my own education. It really struck a chord with me and made me want to challenge what the Crown was all about and my place as a citizen of Britain in sort of the modern world. And coming to Canada was really important for me. So I ended up um, I ended up getting my accreditation through the National Committee on Accreditation. It was a long process, and I have a lot to thank a lot of people for helping me through that. But then once I did that, I then did CPLAD, and I was called to the bar in Saskatchewan in 2012. And I've just really enjoyed the practice side of things and meeting with many of the clients that I got to interact with. Most of my clients were Indigenous, First Nation. I had a few Métis clients here and there, but I started off my practice with criminal defense, child protection, and generally working under Donald Worm and Helen Samaganus and some of the bigger picture legal cases that they had. So that's kind of how I got involved in it all and where I came from.
That's really cool. I mean, so given my ignorance in this area of law, so what does when we talk about Indigenous rights and Indigenous law, what does that typically include? Because I know the basics that Indigenous law is a very separate law; it's not following under the traditional Canadian legal system. But what does that actually look like from your practice perspective?
Well, there's an important distinction to make between Aboriginal law and Indigenous law. So, Indigenous law is inherent laws of First Nations, like Cree laws or Dene laws, Anishinaabe laws. And Aboriginal law is Canadian law as it applies to Indigenous people. So there's many different areas where Canadian law intersects with Indigenous law, and with the increasing self-government, there's more opportunity for Indigenous laws to be implemented and recognized and enforced. And that is a part of the practice that I have, which is supporting First Nations to looking at their oral history and understanding what legal principles come from that oral history for them to be able to modernize and implement their own laws today in a way that hasn't really been available previously because of the stranglehold that provincial law has had over a lot of First Nations. A lot of provincial law has applied on reserve through sort of referential incorporation under the Indian Act. And a lot of First Nations have not had the opportunity to occupy the field, so to speak. But while ever they haven't occupied the field, their right to do so has still existed. So there are a lot of provincial laws that have had an application to First Nations and to First Nation members that have not really had any kind of understanding of the culture of the First Nation when they've come to apply those laws. So you can see a lot of discrimination in the way that certain laws apply, indirect and direct discrimination, and because of that, there is a lot of there's a lot of work in criminal defense and child protection, for example, because child protection is a prime example where in most cases, there are provincial child protection laws that apply on and off reserve. And so,
Mhm.
where they apply on reserve, some First Nations have been able to develop their own internal organizations that make an agreement with the province that they're going to operate underneath that legislation and implement the legislation in their own way. But then there's a lot of funding problems there as to if it is being funded, if a lot of the time it's inadequate funding for them to really implement
Mhm.
procedures that they want to implement. And then what was happening when I was in Saskatchewan in particular was that the provincial laws in surrounding child welfare, the province was seeking to have quality control enforcement and oversight as opposed to really outsourcing the implementation of the law to the First Nation themselves. And so there was a lot of disagreement about um, where the source of the Indigenous law was coming from, whether it
Mhm.
was delegated from the province or whether it was the First Nations' inherent rights to take care of their children and families, and then they had an agreement just to use the provincial laws so that they could get access to the courts. So there's a lot of areas where Indigenous people don't necessarily get the best representation when these laws are being considered and drafted and being put into place. And so having their own First Nation laws is obviously certainly an aspiration for many, but it's something that all First Nations have a right to. So
Yeah.
a lot of the practice of Aboriginal law is understanding how does Canada and different provinces, how do they make space for Indigenous law? And how do they make space for the operation of different legal traditions within the fabric of Canadian Constitution?
So I do want to dive into your practice a bit more, but one thing that I want to better understand is there's clearly some overlap and some gaps when it comes to the legal system in terms of how the system treats Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from a and obviously, and I'm looking at it from a person that does not practice Indigenous law, there's certain costs that are associated with the Canadian legal system that prevents Canadians from accessing it. When it comes, I mean, are those challenges mirrored in Indigenous communities, or are there alternate systems of how these sorts of issues are resolved in the Indigenous context?
That's a good question. I think every single First Nation is different. Not only every First Nation, but also every different culture. So, for example, Secwepemc culture might be completely different from the Mi'kmaq
Right.
culture, for example, and they would have different ways that they would come to resolve their own issues. So, one of the things that I did in Saskatchewan was consider the practice of circles for resolution processes. And so,
Hmm.
in criminal context, there is the opportunity for sentencing circles, for example, and I have participated in a number of sentencing circles as a sort of an alternative way to address sentencing before the criminal courts. So that is certainly one way that the
Yeah.
Indigenous juridical system can have an influence on the Canadian system. Um, I was also involved in some civil litigation as well, where we had a circle. And I'm aware as well in Ontario that there is a lot more opportunity for um, circles in the context of child protection, and that
Hmm.
they frequently exist, especially when considering the different types of agreements that can hold children with their families. So
Cool.
it is available, but it's difficult. You have to really bang the door down.
And I think that's one thing which, as soon as I ask a question, oh yeah, that's right. There's a lot that we. I'm thinking in terms of this colonial mindset where you can group all these interests because like one big group, where obviously
Mhm.
that's not true. So thank you for correcting me. The uh, so let's talk about your practice. So I understand that you started your practice maybe like 5 or 6 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about that decision to start your practice? And obviously, when you start your practice, it's really hard to get clients. And talk a little bit about
Mhm.
what are the things that you needed to do in order to build, in order to become a sustainable practice.
Honestly, that was the most terrifying jump off a cliff I've ever had to embrace. But it was really exciting at the same time. Um, I had been called to the bar for, I think, well, about 10 years at the time. And I was in the middle of going through a divorce. And I decided that the most important thing for me was to continue my legal career. And at some point, I was considering whether or not to just go back to England and try something completely different. But the law is really important to me, and my role as a Canadian lawyer here is something that has been a huge part of my identity. So when it came to deciding to embrace sole practice, as terrifying as it was, I felt that it was a necessary thing to do to protect the clients that I had that were loyal to me, that wanted to continue working with me, and also to keep going with the goals and the priorities that I have. I was very, very lucky that within a few months of starting my own practice, with some of the clients that I had, a lawyer who I am very good friends with, a dear mentor of mine, Delia at PQQ, she reached out to me to ask if I could assist her with some research. And really, that opened my opportunities up to being able to do the work that I'm most qualified for, which is in the field of Aboriginal law and specific claims, and working with First Nations to pursue their own self government. Because a lot of the work that I had done in Saskatchewan was focused towards inherent rights, protecting treaty rights, and enforcing them. And so when I came out to Ontario, I did quite a lot of child protection and a little bit of family law. But I was really looking for some more work in the field of Aboriginal law, and so Delia PQ was, you know, the provider of that work at the time, and we've been working together for 5 years now, and she's fantastic. So I really appreciate everything that she's teaching me on an ongoing basis.
That's really cool. Um, and can you talk a little bit about, because at least for me, I mean, when you first start your practice, it's really hard to know what steps you're going to take next. Um, did Delia was Delia instrumental in talking to you more about the business side of law, or did you have other support from other places to help you out with that?
I had support from other places to help me out with that. Actually, Delia is a sole practitioner, so I we work sort of in association, but at arm's length.
Hmm.
Um, and the some of the other lawyers that assisted me were fantastic. There was a particular lawyer, James Rhodes, who offered me quite a lot of support in terms of the business side of things as to what I needed to look for, learning about different software that he used that he would recommend. And there were a number of people that reached out and were really willing to talk about what they did and how they did it and enable me to feel like it wasn't such a huge step. There's also fantastic materials on the Law Society of Ontario website for sole practitioners and people setting out. So that was really key to going through the checklist, making sure I had everything. There was always something that I was sure I was forgetting because it was so new and there was so much to know. But it has been a system where I've been able to learn as I'm going along, and it doesn't quite matter
Yeah.
if everything's not perfect right from the get-go. And I'm still working on my policies and my internal systems. Um, but yeah, I
And I
received a
think
lot of
that's
mentorship.
and I think that's the interesting part about running a business, because even with myself, I was never like, I'm the first business owner in my family, first lawyer in my family. So the like you, my the decision to start my own practice was a kind of terrifying but scary but exhilarating at the same time.
Yeah.
And you're still learning as you go, but I think finding people in the community and who you can trust for their decision making is such a huge thing. And on that note, I mean, now you were a solo practice, and now you understand you've got staffing. And so, how is that? Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how the things that how your practice day is very different from how you started, and what are the things that listeners should keep in mind when it comes to evolving their practice?
Well, for me, the biggest thing was going slow and being accountable. So I didn't want to hire anybody that I couldn't afford to pay. That was really big for me because in the past I had experienced situations where I hadn't been paid on time or or checks had bounced, and it's really difficult to deal with that. And even harder to deal with that when you are the person responsible. So that was a huge thing that I wanted to avoid ever happening. So I've taken it very slowly and cautiously before I have committed to employing anybody. I worked with people on contracts, part-time hours here and there, and I made sure that they agreed that I would only pay them when I got paid, so that they were able to do the work that I had, and I wasn't promising them more work than I had, but also so that it was sustainable and I could ensure that any work that they actually did, I could pay for them immediately. That was really difficult for me to manage the cash flow, especially when a lot of clients you might be waiting for maybe 2 or 3 months before you get paid sometimes, and especially where there's federal funding involved and you have to apply for federal
Yeah,
funding to be able to do the work. Sometimes you're waiting 6 months to 7 months before you get paid all at once. Um, and
and,
it's really
and that's
difficult.
I think, and I think that's, I mean, I think that's one of the hardest part to appreciate right now with all the changes we're seeing around us. Right?
Mhm.
It's um, a lot of the times you don't necessarily, you might be doing the work, but it could be like weeks, if not months, before we as a business actually getting paid.
Yeah,
And I think that's one of the biggest challenges when it comes to hiring staff.
yeah.
Which if you're on the staff side, you don't necessarily understand, because all you're looking for is a steady paycheck.
Hmm.
But the I and the economic reality right now as a running a law firm is that sometimes you yourself as a business want to make sure you're getting paid, but you can't guarantee it until the clients do pay, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Um, and I think, and I guess on that note, so when it comes to your own practice, like you talked about federal funding, so is it the practice that um, the federal funds are actually used to pay for the work that you're doing?
Yeah, that is often the case, especially with specific claims. So with specific
Okay.
claims, Canada offers research funding, but you have to apply every year, January 31st. So it's a very busy time of year here in January. Because you have to kind of have all of the proposals for your work and any expert witnesses that you anticipate using. You have to submit all of these proposals. And there's limited funding available for each stage and each fiscal year. Sometimes you may not even have enough funding to really move much in that process.
Mm.
So it can be very difficult to manage. Yeah.
So you've got yourself, you've got a couple of other staff members. Do they all work in the office? Are they working remotely? What is the working arrangement, especially if you're doing First Nations claims?
I have to be very remote because in 2021 I had a baby and then I had another baby this year. So I work
Congrats.
mostly in my basement. Thank you. I go into the office once a week, every Monday, and I meet with everybody as part of a big team. We go through sort of a file status chart once a month and determine all of our to-do lists. And every Monday, we sort of check in with each other, see where we are at, and then we will also arrange Zoom meetings to talk about specific files and move them along, and share with each other documents that we need to read and be up to speed on. I like to encourage debate and participation in every single level of the work that we're doing so that we can make sure that there are a second and third pair of eyes on things, not only for the procedural aspects of it, but just also for the legal research. When the more people that are involved in the legal research process, I find you can come up with ideas that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of if it was just you sitting by yourself in front of Ken Lee or whatever it is. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so I like that. I like the meeting up. It's really important to have face to face contact. But because my clients are all over Canada, I part of what we do is travel to them and meet with them in different places when they're in the cities, for example. Um, and so it's important for us to have that remote aspect, in my opinion, because I think,
Hmm.
especially after COVID, there was such a huge push to have everybody at home and working safely in your own environment and trying to make that environment good for occupational health and all of that has been somewhat difficult, but I think it's really important to get that home time. I can go upstairs and I can have lunch with my children. I can feed my baby whenever I need. It's a lot better, this situation, I think, than being in an office all the time.
And I think, I mean, that is definitely one of the underrated aspects when it comes to COVID, because I really do believe that if it wasn't for COVID, we would still be
Hmm.
going to the office like all the time. And uh, like even for myself, like I it in 2020, I welcomed my second child, so I was right in the thick of things. And
Congratulations.
but again, it's congratulations. It's also
Yeah.
the like it was just this time of drastic change,
Yeah.
and nobody really knew what was going to happen next, quote unquote, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I think where I came down and what my thoughts were is that, and especially now, the fact that you have it's far more easier to use technology to be able to see clients while also saying, you know what, I want to be home with my kids. That's a huge thing, right?
Hmm.
And but that being said, I think one of the biggest challenges that comes along with that is there needs to be more systems in place to make sure that things are running effectively. And you've touched on one, these monthly meetings that you're doing. When it and I love the fact that you're doing still the in person thing uh, quite often, because without, at least in my experience, without that face to face interaction, it's really hard to build like a firm culture, right? And
Yeah.
actually connect with people, right? But what are some of the other systems that have really helped you um, manage and delegate effectively, especially when you're working like miles and kilometers away from each other?
Well, I think it's just the interspersement of face-to-face meetings, really, because I might only go down to the office once a week, but also at different times, my colleagues come up to my house and come spend time here with me in my basement office. And we sit together and go through files and go through some of the work. And I think keeping an ongoing to do list and continuously updating it and crossing things off is huge. But I think
That's huge.
also,
Yeah.
going out and having lunch together and doing things where we are interacting um, socially in some way as well is good for a firm culture because it helps to make sure that we're all working on the same page. Um, and a constant email interaction and calls as well. I want to make sure that everybody I'm working with knows that I'm available all the time. If I can't, for whatever reason, pick up the phone, I'll call them back immediately when I can.
Hmm.
And sometimes it's strange hours that I find myself up. So some of my colleagues, one of my colleagues works later on in the evening, my friend Tara, and so she's a night owl, and I'm an early morning riser. So between us, we're exchanging emails at all various times of the day. But it does help that we can each be flexible with one another and really fit the work that we need to do to our own timetable. And one of the things that I've done with regard to that is ensure that the people that I'm working with, they actually only commit to doing 30 hours a week, 30 hours a month for me, and the rest of it is overtime. And so I have
Hmm.
crafted a way for them to build in their own flexibility and really take charge for how much they are working. And so they don't have vacation time off in the same way that ordinary jobs and salaried positions would. They get to choose how they want to use the rest
Right.
of their time, whether it's for work or for other things.
So they're essentially contractors, I'm assuming.
No, they're employees.
Wow, that's a really progressive way of doing things. Because I love the idea. I love the idea of rather than moving from, because one of the biggest challenges is saying X amount of hours a month to, um, or X amount of hours, but the fact that you've got billable hours over a monthly period, that's a really cool idea. Um, can I don't think this is a personal question, but given that you're balancing the needs of your practice with also raising a baby and that important responsibility,
Yeah.
how do you manage like that's and again I'm just
Lead
going
the
back to
way.
my own experience, like oh that would explain it.
Yeah, that's.
Okay,
I have a little swing over here. I've got a play mat there.
that's
Um,
amazing.
I even took my child to Ottawa for some meetings. Um,
So for those listening in,
mhm,
her child is actually in the room right now as we're speaking, which is fantastic.
yeah,
Um, do you ever have people look in saying, "What is that? Why?" Like is there have you had like pushback from people saying that why are you having a baby in the room with you?
I
I
thought
can't
I
imagine,
did,
but
but I haven't had any pushback whatsoever. I think, especially the First
okay,
Nation clients that I have, I was kind of wondering, do you think it's okay for me to bring my baby to our meeting? But everybody loves babies, and and I think it's really important for well, for recognizing that we're in 2025 and there are a lot of working moms, and being able to bring your child to work with you is important. I even took the Restule Supreme Court decision with me to the hospital because it just came out and I was excited to read it. So I didn't really take any mat leave.
amazing,
I didn't take mat leave at all with either of my children, but I've been really lucky because my husband works from home as well. So whenever I have to have appointments or things like that, he's able to take on the caregiving role, and we share very much most of those duties. But my husband, I have to say, as soon as the babies are no longer able to sit quietly with me while I'm typing, they've gone upstairs to their dad or to the ultimate playroom that is our living room. But it's nice
amazing.
because I can go upstairs and be around and be flexible like that, depending on what the situation is. But my little baby, who's
That's
uh,
beautiful.
5 months now, 5 and a bit months, he comes down to the office with me every Monday because he's still feeding. So
Of
he's
course, yeah, no, no,
he's
but And again, I think, I mean, in the type of environmental and civil lit,
Hmm.
there's now a real big push to go back into court and back into stuff, and it's really unfortunate because I think that the idea of working remotely and appearing remotely, it's such an incentive, and it really helps women stay in the legal profession when there's so many other barriers around us.
Hmm.
And forget about women. I mean, like even for men, like fathers, like
Yeah.
I love the fact that I can see my kids. Like it's not a. I don't think it's a women's right issue,
Hmm.
and I think to a certain degree, it's really unfortunate that we're seeing this return of this. It's pushing back into court for a whole host of reasons.
Yeah, I
Uh,
agree. I think it really opened up so many opportunities for there to be more flexible practice of law. I can understand with trials
mhm.
and hearings and how it's important for the court to see people physically. But for a lot of administrative court appearances, it just makes no sense for everybody to all have to be in the courtroom themselves. I much preferred it before they started with this shift back to court. I haven't been able to take on any
I hear you.
since I had uh, since I had my children because of the trial and you know
Yep.
being in court. But I do hope that I can continue doing the work that I'm doing, which is mostly research based and long term sort of litigation, because a lot of
Mhm.
that just requires me being here in my office. It doesn't require a lot of court appearance. Specific Claims Tribunal, a lot of those check-ins are by telephone, um, and uh, and yeah, so I think it's been wonderful for us as a family to be able to work in our house,
Yep.
not have a
Yep.
centralized location.
Um, so when it comes to the future, I mean, what changes do you envision for your practice over the next 4 or 5 years, and um, and maybe in your answer, can you just touch on what how do you see the role of lawyers or solo lawyers evolving in this niche area of Indigenous law?
Well, I think there's a lot of grounds for thinking that sole practice is difficult, I think, for the practice of Indigenous law because there are a lot of very, very big firms that do this work and have a lot of manpower. Um, and I know that some of the things that I've heard have kind of suggested that boutique law firms have a hard time responding to that. But I would counter that and say that with us being a small operation, we get to know our clients intimately, and it's they're a huge priority for us. So we're able to dedicate a lot more time to building the relationship, to learning who our client is and what they really need. And I think there's a lot of value in that sole practice because you're not beholden to any sort of corporate system per se, and you have a lot more discretion.
Mhm.
And that can be really helpful with fees. For example, one of the things that I have done to support my clients and also to encourage them to trust me is to be quite flexible with my fees. And I might not have the same discretion to do that if I was at a larger firm.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of First Nation lawyers and Indigenous Inuit and Métis lawyers that are coming up now through the universities, a lot more than there have been in the past. And and I think sole practice would be a good option for many of them, particularly if they want to remain close to home in their own environments rather than being forced to come to the cities and practice as part of a larger firm. I do hope that a lot of that remote practice opportunity can support sole practitioners having more associations with one another and mentoring and
Mhm.
helping each other that way. Most of the referrals I get are from other lawyers, for example. So I think there's definitely a role for sole practice, but I know that I'm an honorary member of the Indigenous Bar Association, and going to those full conferences every single year is really, really important for me because it's how I really interact and have a community in the Indigenous legal field is through my interactions with my good colleagues and friends who go there.
That's very cool. And again, re-emphasizing the need to have a community when it comes to both
Hmm.
building out a practice and building out a client base. Um, and I think the other question is, what changes do you envision for your practice? Do you see, like, over the next 4 or 5 years, what are the things that you're looking for?
Well, I just did a huge 5 year plan. I sat there on 31st of December going, what do I want for the next 5 years? Um, and I think my biggest goal to uh, is to just grow in the situation that I have, support the clients that I have, and get some of their cases over the finish line. I'm really excited to and dedicated to the work that I have right now. I have a lot of really good clients and some very interesting cases. So I'm excited to keep going on those, and I'm looking forward to all the legal wormholes that I'm going to get to go down. And I do hope to perhaps hire some new lawyers in the future. I want to
Hmm.
possibly offer some scholarships or support for Indigenous students, particularly from my colleagues First Nation or from that treaty region, because that's the treaty region that
Hmm.
we work with. So it would be wonderful to be able to give something back and reciprocate their trust in me, and being able to serve them in their legal affairs with supporting some of their own members to join the practice of law, and feel supported both as students, but also if they decide to take the plunge and become lawyers themselves.
Uh, do you see technology? I mean, it's just like you talk about growth, but do you see tech? I mean, especially because you talk about remotely, where do you see technology playing when it comes to your practice?
Well, that's an interesting thought because there are a lot of, there's one person that I'm thinking of potentially working with this summer who will live in Saskatchewan and work remotely. And so I think the option and ability to work remotely can really be a connection. And it can support a lot wider mentorship generally. I am hopeful that people will stop using AI for some of the legal research, because some of the things that I've seen, the things that are cited, they don't really match up when you go and look at the case law. And it worries me that
Yeah.
there is a lot of outsourcing to AI. Um, it's not as diligent as it needs to be at this moment in time. Maybe it will.
Well, you should not. No, no. It's not that it's done. You should not be using
Oh, never.
AI for legal research. Like that is an absolute no-no.
Yeah.
And I don't. I mean, all of these. I mean, and as someone that does use AI in my practice for very different things, I would never use AI for anything that's mission critical,
Yeah.
because you cannot. It's just not at the place where it is ready for that sort of thing. It might be ready at some point in the future, but at least for now. And most of all, I think a lot of people are over reliant on it,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't actually take the steps they need to actually do the due diligence necessary to make sure that it's right. You
That
know,
worries me a lot. Yeah, I'm currently trying to assist somebody behind the scenes pro bono, in support of they're self represented before the courts at the moment, and a lot of the initial research that they've been doing has been based on AI, just to get them started, to help them know where to look, and I have found that some of it can be useful in terms of showing you where to look, but then a lot of the times when it's citing things, it's very general, and sometimes it's completely
you
wrong.
can't.
So
Yeah, you can't.
yeah.
Um, Thanks for that, Josephine. I really appreciate it. Some quick lightning round questions.
Okay.
So, uh, uh, if there is a book that's really influenced your practice or the way you look at the world, what book would that be?
A book. Oh goodness.
And if it's not a
Um,
book, like a resource or yeah,
it would be the Treaties of Canada with Alexander Morris.
cool.
This
Yeah.
has got everything in it that I need a lot of the time in my practice to understand the Crown's version of events, and then you have to go back and you have to learn the oral history and understand that that was just one version of events. There's a whole other version of events that relate to what the actual interpretation of the treaty should be.
Uh, then following up on that, if there's what is the best piece of advice a mentor has given you?
Um, I think there's some it's a wonderful phrase that just sticks out in my head, which is, "Pardon me for speaking while you were interrupting me." And it reminds me just, it was something that I heard said by a mentor of mine in court, and it's to stand up and not be afraid to object and not be afraid to fill the space. And in big letters on a piece of paper was held up to me, "Slow down." Because I find when you are about to give your representations to the court, if you're anxious, you speed up and you go high pitched. And I think just slowing down, feeling comfortable in the space was something that I really learned from my good old mentor, Don Worm.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
And last one, what is the most unexpected skill that you've developed as a solo lawyer?
Oh, most unexpected skill. Um, well, it's just multitasking. I think I never knew what multitasking really was until I did sole practice.
Well, especially as a mother, like that
Yeah,
is something you guys are
yeah.
superhuman that way somehow. That's the way you do it. Um, so before we wrap up, I mean, what's next for you, and what are you looking to do over the next year or so?
Well, I want to increase the workflow. I want to keep researching and helping my clients with the work that we currently have before us. But I also have some ideas for bringing friends together and talking about how we can all benefit one another with the different skills that we have. And one of the things I'm really interested in is looking to ourselves to say, well, how do we want to change the next 5 years to make the world a better place for us? Whether that's with other lawyers and sole practitioners working out how we want to improve things, or even if it's just having a conversation with the people in my friendship circle to determine if we could do anything in the world, what would it be that we would do to change things and make things better for our children or for the next generation. And I think having those
That's amazing.
in mind is an important way to frame what you're going to do with the next 5 years.
That's amazing. Uh, how can listeners connect with you and learn more about your work?
Well, I have a website, jdewhytell-law.com, and I am quite active on Facebook. So I'm part of a number of sole practitioner organizations and Facebook groups as well.
Thank you so much, Josephine. I
Thank
really
you very much.
appreciate you sharing, especially the experience of you running a practice and being a mother. And I think this idea of Indigenous law and the challenges it brings, I think is something that I think we all can really learn from when it comes to building our practices, and the fact that you've really targeted a niche, and
Mhm.
then you've really developed the skills in the community to build out a sustainable practice. So thank you so much. I really
Thank
appreciate
you
it.
very much
I
for having
really
me.
appreciate the
It's a
conversation.
pleasure.
Okay, good. Okay, cheers.